All right, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue Ellen Hirschman-Cherepnen and President of Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. And we will start off this meeting with our land acknowledgement. Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment acknowledges that the residents of Watertown live on land that is the traditional territory of the Pequawset people, a band of the indigenous Massachusetts tribe. The Pequawset cared for and stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. The English language rendering of the indigenous name of Watertown is Pigsgusset, which to the best of our knowledge means the meadows at the widening of the river. We recognize that indigenous erasure and attempted genocide are still happening today and demand supportive action and solidarity. Let us remember the achievements of the Pigsgusset peoples and the ongoing struggles of their descendants as we reflect on how we can be good visitors and stewards of this place we call home. And now I just want to welcome everyone who's here. It's a great turnout. I think it's going to be a great program, and it's really nice to have so many interested folks here. A couple little things, just that we want to make sure everyone is respectful and be conscious of how long you may speak for during the Q&A time. And we request if people during the Q&A would please use the electronic hand to let us know that you would like to comment or ask a question. And if you're on a phone and can't do that, just let us know. We need to do that. Also, we've decided for tonight to not have people put links in the chat, that it can be a bit distracting as people come up with different ideas and want to share those. But you can send them to watertowncitizens@gmail.com, and then we will add them to our website. And so again, just please, if you can't get your full name onto your screen, just put it into the chat so that we'll have it for attendance. And just stay muted when you're not speaking. That would be great. And I think we'll move right on to what we always do at the beginning of our meetings is a very short reports, updates from our working groups. Obviously, the Peace and Common Security group doesn't need to give us an update since they are doing a special presentation. And so I wanted to start, and I haven't had a chance, I'm sorry, to identify exactly who would like to give these reports. So I'm just going to ask now. Someone from Watertown Faces Climate Change. Could someone give a brief update?
Jackie and I are both here, and I guess you can add. We keep meeting every 2 weeks. Hopefully, our next meeting we're going to try hybrid. We have a new projector from Watertown Citizens that we can use, so we're going to give it a try.
Okay.
And
is there chat?
Is things okay? So we continue to work on how to implement the climate action plan and local development. We are part of 350.org, and they're having a big conference on Saturday to try and set the agenda for the next year in terms of legislation. And we got the Fair Share Amendment passed. Yay!
Great, thank you. Someone from Pigsgusset Initiative, would you like to give a quick update?
Hi, thanks, Sue Ellen. Yes, I will be happy to do that.
Great.
Right now, we don't have a lot going on, although hopefully we're starting to plan for next year's Indigenous Peoples Day. So if people are interested in helping us, that would be great. And also, this is Native American Heritage Month, and there are a number of events and activities going on. So please, I don't have anything to post right now, but look on line and see what's out there, because there's a lot of good stuff. So thank you.
All right. And of course, people maybe are familiar with the National Day of Mourning in what we call I guess what's called Patuxet, I believe it, and Native Americans about in Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day, known as National Day of Mourning. It's quite moving and really quite something. If you've never been before, it's very, very, very inspiring. Friends of Bees, Pam, want to give us a brief update on your work?
Sure. I just want to note, a couple of people have been asking people to provide pronouns. If you're willing to, I think probably, if you're working on updating your name, you can throw your pronouns in there too as well. Friends of Bees has been working with Watertown Community Gardens all year, and we've got several public pollinator gardens scattered around Watertown. And I'm getting distracted by the waiting room. And so we're looking towards making Watertown a bee city next year, and starting work on looking into basically what it entails, you know, the pollinator committee and the ordinance and all that. And in January, we're planning to do a winter sowing workshop. Winter sowing is important because our native bees need native plants, and most native plants, when they set seed at the end of the summer, the seed is supposed to lay there on the ground all winter. And winter sowing is a way of doing that process inside basically a milk jug. So we're looking for locations for that. And if anyone's interested in the winter sowing workshop, you can send an email to friendsofbees@watertowncitizens.org.
Great, thank you, Pam. Watertown Communities for Black Lives. Someone like to give us a working group update?
I can do a very brief one, a little off the cuff. Our last monthly meeting on the first Monday, as usual, we were really happy to have a guest lead an exercise. It was actually Jennifer who was there as a representative of the Pigs Gusset Initiative, and someone who had put some sort of personal energy into gathering information about looking at the ideas of indigeneity versus race and racism, since they can get conflated. So it was a very interesting discussion and barely scratched the surface of a very deep and important set of ideas. And we think that next month we'll be talking about, on our first Monday meeting, that'll be December, I think it's 5th, what it means for us as a group to be a place where people can come to bring concerns about racism in our local community, kind of where we fit in among other resources that are here. What's our unique place in the city to deal with, to address systemic racism. We also have still have our monthly vigils, and would welcome people to come on, usually it's second Tuesdays for those. And we're waiting to hear about grants, whether we'll get grant funding for Juneteenth for next summer. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyler. That's great. I'll give a very brief report for the Refugee Support Working Group. We're still kind of following up on our big fundraiser we had with Yo-Yo Ma. It was online, and I know many of you here contributed and donated, so thank you for all that. We're still getting some checks kind of rolling in, and some people still wanting to make donations, and we're getting all our thank yous out slowly. So that's basically what we're doing, and of course, all that same time, we're helping families with many, many different problems and things that they need. So that's basically it. So I have just a couple brief announcements, and then we will start our presentation. So on behalf of the Peace and Common Security Group, there's a vigil on Ukraine on Sunday, November 20th from 1 to 2 o'clock. And it's under the banners, Negotiate, Not Escalate, Support Ukraine, and that negotiation is always better than war. And then just to mention also for Peace and Common Security that there's a planned reading and discussion of the book, the Ukraine War, Making Sense of a Senseless War. I think it's Medea Benjamin, no? Yes. I'm just reading a note from Tony, and during the first hour of the meeting on January 8th. And if you're interested, you can just email peaceandsecurity@gmail.com. And the book is available from Code Pink and also from Mass Peace Action for $17. And also the group has asked our library in Watertown to order 2 copies. So moving on, at this point, unless someone has an announcement that they're urgently needing to make, we will move on to our presentation. And I would like to turn over the hosting of the meeting right now to Susan Nye. So Susan, it's all yours.
Hi. So nice to see so many people here. We're up to 74 people. I know a lot of you I've never met, but thank you so much for coming. I live in Watertown, and I've supported Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment for many years. I wasn't very active until recently when I started taking part in the vigils supporting Ukraine. And I also joined this Peace and Common Security Working Group. My good friend Tony told me that our agenda would include the issue of justice for the Palestinians, and I have very high regard for my fellow group members, and we hope others will join us. I work in several areas that strive to promote justice for the Palestinians. Most of my efforts are with Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East. And I've been a board member and treasurer of that group for 20 years now. If there are UUs here who don't know of our work, I will put a link in later after we get to the Q&A. I'll put a link into the chat for our database and how to sign up with us. Regarding the tonight, I hope you have read the article that was referenced in the invitation. I found it very important for several reasons. I know the authors, and they're wonderful. I have very high regard for their knowledge and sincerity. I also appreciate the fact that it puts this problem in a wider context. Justice for the Palestinians should be acknowledged by any progressive person who believes in anti-racism, the rights of indigenous people, opposition to settler colonialism, immigrant rights, water rights, human rights, and there are others. Palestinian just don't get they don't get a seat at the table in many progressive circles. So I think that the article helps people get that. So I hope you share my interest in hearing more from the authors. So I think it's time to let my good friend Abby Yano take over, who will moderate this program.
Good evening, everybody. So nice to see you all here. I'm Abby Yano. I'm most active with the Mass Peace Action Palestine-Israel Working Group. I'm formerly a member of Watertown Citizens Steering Committee. We are very happy to have 2 speakers with us. Elsa Auerbach, who is the professor emerita at the University of Massachusetts, and Eve Spangler, who's an associate professor of sociology at Boston College, and they will say more about themselves as they introduce themselves. Which of you is going first? I can't remember. Elsa, unmute. Elsa, yeah.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, you'd think that this old dog would know all the new tricks, but apparently I don't. Yeah, I am the daughter of refugees from Germany who were Jewish and who left because of Hitler. And as I was, we moved to the Midwest, and I actually was raised as a Unitarian. And for a long time, really almost until my 50s, I thought I was anti-Semitic because I thought you had to support Israel in order to be a good Jew. And it was, even though I, identified as Jewish culturally, I really, from the early 70s, was aware of the injustices that the Palestinian people were experiencing. And I was active in the anti-apartheid movement for South Africa and immigration rights and anti-war movements and so on. But it really wasn't until I retired that I became more actively involved in the issue. I feel like I kind of came full circle in my life to understand how actually my own identity was very relevant to the struggle for justice in Palestine. So that's, that's what I do now mainly, is I really focus on the liberation of Palestine, the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. Eve, are you there? Earth to Eve.
Yes, I also have to unmute. I'm completely not only old, but tech phobic. And like Elsa, I'm the daughter of Holocaust refugees from Austria, though, not Germany. My mother was the head chaperone on the last children's train, the Kindertransport, that was allowed to leave just before the war engulfed Austria. And my dad, who was also Austrian, but whom she met here in refugee circles, came to this country sponsored by relatives, was picked up by a Jewish philanthropy because he was working on a doctoral dissertation at the University of Vienna at the time he left. And they offered to send him to Harvard to finish his dissertation on the condition that he not work and that that the dissertation be his only work and that he get through as quickly as possible so they could sponsor other people. But they thereby set up this kind of Sophie's choice where, because he would be not working, he couldn't sponsor his family. And he had been sent ahead by his family to rescue his family. So of course he chose his family over his career and brought them to this country, and then, had a very modest career because after the end of the war, smart Jewish intellectuals from Central Europe were a dime a dozen and nobody was shepherding them into Harvard. So I grew up with a sense that the abyss could open up at your feet at any moment. And in my family, it was not a religion, but we looked to socialism rather than to religion as a source of social justice. And I can't recall there ever being any interest in Israel in my family, which was not unlike many American Jews who were afraid of being accused of divided loyalties. But there wasn't much talk about Israel in my family. But, the sense of ethics I did get was that all human beings are equally entitled to be treated justly, and that was the struggle. My first political activism was in high school. There was a school boycott in New York City led by the Reverend Milton Galamis, and public schools were 100% segregated. And the Black community figured out that schools got money on a per diem basis from the state, so that if the Black community boycotted the school system would suddenly get a lot less money and would get their attention. And so I was teaching a kindergarten class during the school boycott, that they had kids in churches so that they weren't truant and running wild. And I got on that occasion to annoy Malcolm X. And so I can tell you that story later. It's not part of this presentation. But if you start with a Jewish ethic of a single creator and a single creation, the ethical implications are that we are all brothers and sisters. And that's the standard to which we should aspire to live up to. And in this case, it means, I think in the case of Israel-Palestine, that yes, of course, Jews are entitled to safety, but so are Palestinians. And the safety of Jews cannot be instead of that of Palestinians or at the expense of that of Palestinians. We all need to move forward together. And that's what I've been working on now since 2003. Teaching at BC and taking students to Israel-Palestine over winter break and writing books and meeting with people like you. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for showing up. I'm delighted we have such a large audience, and I hope you'll be happy with the presentation.
Okay, great. So I want to start now.
Elsa, can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yes.
Tony and Sue Ellen, could we ask people to stop posting in chat while Elsa and Eve are giving their presentation? It's rather distracting. Would that be okay?
Yes,
That would be great.
it's
Thank
fine
you.
with me.
You can
And also
actually
ask if people
disable
would
the
please
chat
be-
during the presentation.
If people would also please be respectful in the chat and stop and not be attacking one another or each other. That would be really helpful. If not, we might need to remove you from the meeting if you cannot be respectful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I want to just start by acknowledging the very scary moment that we're in. And it's a moment when anti-Semitism is surging in the US and around the world. It's a virulent rise in anti-Semitism. And of course, we oppose anti-Semitism with all of our hearts, based on our own experiences and the whole notion that anti-Semitism is actually a form of racism. That being said, there are different ways that people frame what anti-Semitism is. And one of the things that's also happening right now in the world is that anti-Semitism is being used as a tool. The charges of anti-Semitism are being used as a tool to shut down political discourse. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on a little bit today. Another aspect of the current reality is that the recent Israeli elections have exposed overtly what many of us have known for a long time, which is that Israel is founded on an ideology that puts the safety of one set of people over the safety of another. It's a government that's actually based on Jewish supremacy and rooted in the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, where when I say the ethnic cleansing, what it means is that starting in 1948, Palestinian people were really forced off their land and experienced many of the same things that my parents as refugees experienced. And right now in Israel, the emperor has no clothes. Jewish supremacy, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonialism are actually the policies of the Israeli government. It's an ethno-supremacist state. And because the emperor has no clothes, Israelis have kind of resorted to Donald Trump tricks, lying and claiming victimhood. And the reason for that is there aren't any good defenses for what Israel is doing in relationship to the Palestinian people. So that's why they're saying it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. They've got nothing else. There have been numerous, I guess Eve is going to go into this, but there have been many research studies grounded in international law, using the frames of international law, that show that Israel is an apartheid state. And so what we're going to do now is tonight is to go into some of the underlying facts that really substantiate this and show how the accusation of anti-Semitism is being instrumentalized to shut down the discussion of what Israel is doing. And I'm going to turn it over to Eve now, who's going to give some background, and then I'm going to kind of bring things up to the present and to what is really we're confronting in this moment.
Wonderful.
Eve,
Yes.
Eve, I'm sorry, would you mind, can we ask once again, in case you didn't hear, we're asking you to suspend your messages in the chat in favor of hearing our two speakers, and then we'll open it up. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you again, all of you, for attending. I was going to start with a summary of the article, but I think many of you have read it, most of you perhaps. So I will, and Elsa has very wonderfully covered most of the substance. I'll just say would start where the article makes the case for that the fight for social justice, including safety, is everyone's fight. And it is on behalf of everyone, and that any so-called fight for justice that privileges any religious or ethnic or racial group at the expense of others is not part of that struggle. So I want to propose, I'm going to go into a little bit of the background of where Zionism comes from, and with the intent of helping you to fight false flag, charges of anti-Semitism directed at people who criticize Zionism or the behavior of the Israeli state and who don't hate Jews. I mean, those charges now are being leveled even against people like us who are Holocaust implicated families and Jewish. And I think that often for Americans, one of the best ways to grasp kind of the logic of Zionism is in comparison with the civil rights movement, with the African-American civil rights movement. So that's where I'm going to start. And with the observation that Jewish folks in Europe and Black people in America were traditionally in the past a terribly mistreated group, murderously mistreated, ghettoized, marginalized, underserved, stereotyped. Every bad word you can think of applies to both the Jewish experience in Europe and the Black experience in America. And people situated in a community suffering those assaults have a limited number of sort of overall strategies. They may have many, many individual specific projects, but there are a limited number of strategies for dealing with that kind of oppression. One is, the most common one is assimilation. You try to keep your head down, you try to go along to get along. Because for most people, just the work of ordinary life, you get up in the morning, you make the kids sandwiches, you get them off to school, you go to work, you pick up the dry cleaning on the way home, you make dinner, you supervise the homework, you remember to send a birthday card to your mother-in-law. You know, by that time, there's not a lot of energy left for other things. So assimilation is one strategy. For those with more energy, or perhaps fewer kids, reform and is also a fairly common pushback against marginalization. So you have a civil rights movement, you have all kinds of rights movements. For Jews, that often actually did take the form of socialism, the reform impulse, because socialism had a number of advantages. It didn't require you to renounce your Judaism. It simply made it not relevant. If you were a proletarian, if you were a working person, then you were in socialist understanding on history's winning team. And so you could be a Jew and proud of it and be struggling for social justice as a working person, as a proletarian. Socialism was also useful in that it allowed you to address multiple governments all over the continent, and the effort to make life safe for Jews is, of course, continent-wide. And so, you know, that was the reform effort. But for a minority in both the Black and Jewish communities, came to the conclusion that they wouldn't be allowed to assimilate, that reform was hopeless. And so the third option is exit. Okay, you can decide to leave a place where you feel you will never be safe. And so we have a Back to Africa movement in America, and we have Zionism, the desire to go build a Jewish something somewhere else, a Jewish existence somewhere else. Now, the founders of both movements, it has to be said, were engaged in a political project and not a religious project. And from the beginning, Zionists were divided as to what the particular ask of Zionism was. So there were Zionists who wanted what was come to be called cultural Zionism. That is, they wanted to add themselves in as an accepted group in Israel, or what was then Mandate Palestine, into a multicultural society in which they too could be safe. And the cultural Zionists included such pretty intelligent people as Albert Einstein, Hannah Arendt, and Martin Buber. And they were looking for a Jewish homeland, right? Now, the part of Zionism that prevailed were Zionists who were looking for a Jewish state, a state which would belong only to Jews and in which other people would be unwelcome and indeed could be removed. And the Jewish state part of Zionism prevailed in the end and continues to prevail to this day. And in part, I think historically, because Zionists understood themselves, in the words of Israeli historian Shlomo Avineri, to be facing not one threat, the threat of extinction or annihilation in its most extreme form. And you have to remember that Zionism begins 75 years before the Holocaust, so it's referencing many forms of oppression and exclusion, not exclusively the Holocaust. But anyway, Zionists were facing two threats in their own minds. In Eastern Europe, annihilation potentially, but in Western Europe, assimilation. And that's a debate that continues to reverberate in the Jewish community today, where I'm told something like 50% of American Jewish young people marry non-Jews. So Zionism, the state Zionist version, posed answers to both the physical threat by creating a room of one's own, and to the threat of assimilation by creating a room of one's own that was empty of anybody else. Now, this view reveals that Zionist founders were deeply embedded in, the race and class of their time, because they wanted a Jewish state. They were actually somewhat ecumenical about where the state should be located. And by the time of the first Zionist Congress, which was in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland, after it was kicked out of Berlin because the German Jews didn't want to be accused of divided loyalties, by the time of the first Zionist Congress, there were actually existing Zionist colonies in Argentina funded by the Baron de Hirsch in France. And so Argentina was a candidate for the Jewish state. Upland Uganda was a candidate for the Jewish state. And this was all in service to Jews were gentle people who needed a gentle climate. They needed an appropriate climate for European folks to flourish. And Palestine obviously was also on the list of potential places. The British offered Palestine, the British who were a powerful empire at that time, and they offered it officially because of biblical, links that they acknowledged, but more really because it secured an overland route to India, which is what they cared about. So the British said in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, you can have Palestine or parts of Palestine without prejudice to the indigenous community. Herzl, who was the founder of Zionism and the directors of the first Zionist Congress, were in fact so skeptical about Palestine because it was reputed to be a kind of white man's grave in terms of climate. There were swamps and alligators and snakes and things like that. They sent a delegation of rabbis before the convening of the first Zionist Congress to Palestine to look over the land and see whether it was suitable and whether they wanted to do the deal with the British. And the rabbis, as ordered, cabled back to the opening day of the first Zionist Congress in May of 1897. And their cable said, "The bride is very beautiful, but she is married to another man." Okay, the bride is very beautiful, but she's married to another man. So from the first day of the first Zionist Congress, the leadership, not necessarily most of the rank and file or even any of the rank and file, but the leadership understood that to have a Zionist state in Palestine, that could not be realized without ethnic cleansing. And they spoke to it very candidly. And if people want, I can read you a bunch of quotes to that effect from Jabotinsky, from David Ben-Gurion, from the contemporary versions of that, or from the historian Benny Morris. But they were very, very clear that, and it's now codified in the Israeli nation state law, that Israel is a state of Jews around the world, not a state of its citizens. And so Palestinians who can be citizens are not entitled to other kinds of rights. So, ethnic cleansing was written in the plans. That was called the Nakba. It started before the partition and continued through, and is continuing to this day. In the 800,000, for example, olive trees that have been demolished. This is very like killing the bison in the American plains so that American Indians would starve. In the land that continues to be expropriated, in the homes that continue to be demolished, and all the things that are documented by Jewish human rights groups like B'Tselem, Palestinian human rights groups like Al-Haq, the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, which right now has within the Secretariat of the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Refugees has convened a committee of investigation into Palestinian Israeli behavior in Palestine, and they're finding all of the same things that everybody finds when they look. So, so from the day that Zionism, which styles itself as sort of back to the Israelite kingdom, and the Back to Africa folks, which, you know, style themselves as resurrecting wonderful African kingdoms, these are political projects and not religious projects. They have further similarities. And when I started writing my book, I was so blind, you know, I thought about Back to Africa and I thought, oh, that's a bit of a reach. And then I found so many parallels. It was quite startling to me. So both Back to Africa and Zionism were rejected by most of their alleged beneficiaries. Most Black Americans did not want to go to Liberia. Most European Jews did not, at least initially, think going off to Palestine was a good idea. The leadership of these movements was not authorized by anybody. They weren't elected by anybody. They were self-appointed spokespeople. And they were hostile to the interest, even if you concede a tenuous connection to earlier kingdoms, they were hostile necessarily to the indigenous population that got in the way of their dreams. They were going to build their own community, and oh gosh, people were living there. Well, they had to go. So both Zionists and the Back to Africa projects were creating safety for one group of people at the expense of another group of people. In effect, they were saying, oh my God, my house burned down, so now I'm going to come and take your house. And, you know, to say that is emphatically not anti-Semitic, it's not racist, it's telling the truth from which the struggle for justice has to depart. So that would be my quick background, and happy in the Q&A to fill in details.
Thank you, Eve. I'm going to try to bring this up to date a little bit in terms of actually how things are playing out right under our noses. And I want to say that I'm really interested in the chat, because it seems like there are quite a few people in the chat who have been told a different story, and who seem to think that Palestinians posed a threat to Jews when they emigrated, without taking into account the ways in which Palestinians were forced off their land and were murdered and assassinated. And the thing that I learned when I was growing up, the mantra in my family was always never again. But it wasn't just never again, it was never again for anyone. And that's the source of my own feeling of horror when I see the circumstances that Palestinians are being forced to live in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And that's where I'm coming from. I feel that you don't have to support Palestinians. You don't have to be anti-Israeli, or you don't have to be Palestinian to support Palestinians' fight for basic human rights. You just have to be human. And that's really the basis of my own engagement with this. So right now there's a whole discourse about the new anti-Semitism. And what the new anti-Semitism means is that if you critique Zionism, you are anti-Semitic. And this is not as Eve has said, this is like comparing apples and oranges. Zionism is actually a political philosophy, and Judaism, obviously, is a religion. However, the notion that anti-Zionism, which is being opposed to the idea of a Jewish supremacist state. Yes, I am using the term Jewish supremacist because what it means is Jewish people, as inscribed in law, have more rights, are superior. It is a Jewish state that excludes those who are not Jewish. And it doesn't exclude them, it diminishes them, it gives them fewer rights, and so on. That's a supremacist state. Just as if you were to oppose Protestant forms of slavery, it wouldn't be anti-Protestant to oppose that. You would be opposing slavery. Well, I'm opposing supremacy. I'm not opposing Judaism. I'm opposing the supremacy piece of that. And what's happening right now is that there is one specific tool that's being used internationally to instrumentalize the notion that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. And it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. The Israeli government and major Zionist organizations in the US are trying to leverage the legitimate horror at white supremacist anti-Semitism to impose the IHRA definition as a legal standard for silencing opposition to Israeli policies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the definition is, why it's really a flawed definition, how it's being used, and what we can do about it. And now I'm hoping that, Abby, you can put the slide up that I sent so you can actually, people can.
Susan, do you have that? Susan Nye?
So people can read the definition for themselves. Okay, so if you read the, don't look at the part below the bolded part yet. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Well, that's fine, but what does it mean? It's kind of gobbledygook. It's very vague, it's incoherent, and it actually doesn't make things clearer. What is a certain perception of Jews? Who gets to decide what a certain perception of Jews is? It doesn't actually give us something useful that could be a real tool for identifying clearly what anti-Semitism is. But that's not what the real problem is. The real problem is that if you dig a little bit deeper, you see that actually there's an insidious subtext, which is that you need in order to be not anti-Semitic, you must support the state of Israel. And now I want you to look, can you scroll down a little bit? Susan or Abby or whoever is doing this. I don't want you, I'm not asking you to read all this. I just want you to see the stuff that's highlighted in red. And what that shows is that, in fact, there are examples given that are supposed to illustrate what anti-Semitism is. And 7 of the 11 examples reference Israel. So there's a kind of an equation of Israel, Zionism, and Judaism. And I object to that. because I don't support the policies of the state of Israel. For example, calling Israel a racist state is considered anti-Semitic, despite all of the evidence that, in fact, an apartheid state with separate laws for Israelis and Palestinians has been documented extensively by international lawyers in multiple reports, including reports to the UN by Amnesty International and many other legal entities. So just the narrow legal definition of apartheid, in fact, applies to the laws and practices, the laws inscribed into law and practices of the Israeli state.
Elsa, could you give an example of one of those laws?
I'm not going to take questions right now. We'll do questions at the end. Who was it that was asking that question, please?
Peter, somebody.
Okay, the questions are coming at the end, so please, wait until we get there. I want to not interrupt my flow. I think that Stephen Lowe can tell you the exact number of laws. I don't have that in my head because I have age-appropriate memory loss when it comes to numbers.
More than 65.
More than 65 laws actually are discriminatory against Palestinians. Okay, so also saying that contemporary Israeli policy can be compared to policies of the Nazis is considered anti-Semitic. So for me to say that there are parallels between my parents' experience of losing their homes, losing their livelihoods, and losing their families is similar to experiences of Palestinians that I know makes me an anti-Semite, according to this definition. Asserting Jewish people's right to self-determination presents a carte blanche for Israelis to impose their rule on Palestinians. And then there's another one that actually I have no idea what it means, but there's one that says saying it's anti-Semitic to apply double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation is very befuddling. However, it's one of the examples that's invoked all the time at the UN. So even though these examples actually were deleted from the agreed upon definition by the authors of the definition, later on it was appended and the definitions were reinserted as quote unquote optional. So that when you adopt the definition, if you adopt the definition, you can adopt the examples or not. It's up to you. What's important here is to understand that speaking about criticism of Israel or Zionism as anti-Semitic is a misuse of the term anti-Semitic and actually an abuse of what anti-Semitism is. Anti-Semitism is directed at Jews because they are Jews. Criticism of Israel or Zionism is directed at a nation state and a political, not a religious ideology. It's apples and oranges. There's nothing discriminatory or anti-Semitic about challenging any or all policies of any nation state, including the Jewish state. So when I'm criticizing Jewish supremacy in Israel, I'm criticizing supremacy, not Judaism. This is the basis of the state of Israel, and it should be criticized, just as supremacy of white Christian slaveholders should be criticized, or the settler colonial ideology of the Puritans should be criticized. It's not because of who they are, it's because of what they're doing. And ironically, this is the really ironic part, the definition doesn't do anything to actually stop real anti-Semitism as it's being played out by white supremacists and Trump supporters and right-wing bigots and Christian Zionists and so on. So why is the IHRA getting such traction right now? In my view, there are two reasons. One which is a good reason and one which is not so good reason. The first is that there is genuine horror among well-intentioned people as they witness the egregious anti-Semitism, attacks on Jews because they are Jews. And these people want to stand against it. But the second reason is a manipulative, deeply funded opportunism by Zionists in the state of Israel in capitalizing on this horror about anti-Semitism. Quite simply, people are being sold a bill of goods. The IHRA definition is being sold as the gold standard for identifying anti-Semitism. And people want to believe that they are righteous by signing onto it, even without understanding the subtext of the definition. Now, one of the things that the authors of the definition were incredibly clear about is that the definition is just a tool and should never be codified into law. But now it's being pushed as a legal and administrative tool to punish people who are supportive of Palestinian rights. The IHRA definition has been adopted in one form or another in approximately 37 countries, and both Trump and Biden have flirted with this definition, particularly in the US Department of Education regulations. 27 states in the United States have either advanced a proclamation or an executive order recognizing the definition as the working definition of anti-Semitism. There's a push all around the country to get city councils to adopt the definition. It was adopted in Montgomery County, Maryland last week, and by the LA City Council on November 2nd. And my assessment is that these are well-intentioned adoptions of the definition that don't understand the political agenda behind it. University administrations have endorsed it and are using it as a tool to censor or shut down events, penalize student groups, and deny tenure. Just this week at Rutgers University, it was used as a way to shut down Palestine solidarity organizations. Even the original drafter, or one of the original drafters of the definition, sees these uses of the definition as dangerous, contrary to its original intent, as a way to, which is that it's being used to curtail debate on campuses. There's a large portfolio documenting the ways in which the attacks are being used to silence free speech and Palestinian rights that has been compiled by Palestine Legal. And it's you can Google distorted definition redefining anti-Semitism to silence advocacy for Palestinian rights. So at worst, if it's formally adopted by governments, police, universities, etc., it can criminalize many forms of Palestinian solidarity. But at best, I mean, even if it isn't codified into law, the effect of the definition is to threaten free speech and the right to protest because of its chilling effect. In other words, people self-censor. And just now, if you've been following this, I don't know if you've been following this in the news, but the latest arena for this battle about the IHRA definition is in the United Nations. Israel and the US are pushing for its adoption, but in a statement published on November 3rd, 128 Jewish scholars and scholars of the Holocaust asked that the United Nations not adopt the definition, and said that the IHRA is, quote unquote, politicized definition that is instrumentalized to deter free speech and to shield the Israeli government from accountability for its actions. The UN Special Rapporteur for Contemporary Forms of Racism has come out strongly in opposition to the definition, saying it has an, quote unquote, an impact on the human rights of minorities and vulnerable groups, including Jews, and called it controversial and divisive. Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Palestinian territories, has said, by ignoring and suppressing the Palestinian experience of victimhood, the IHRA working definition provokes a clash. A victims-based approach should always be embedded into a human rights perspective and a universal determination to combat racism and discrimination wherever it arises. Well, in fact, all of this is playing out right now in Massachusetts. At the state level, Governor Baker issued a proclamation that included endorsement of the IHRA definition. The towns of Sharon, Mass, and Peabody.
I don't care.
The towns of Sharon, Mass, and Peabody have formally adopted the IHRA definition. In April of 2022, the Lappin Foundation hosted an event to urge adoption of the IHRA that was attended by 160 Massachusetts municipal leaders. And I unfortunately wasn't able to see whether anybody from Watertown was also participating in that. I would appreciate that whoever is playing that music to mute themselves. Even though we don't know of any current attempts to introduce this definition in city councils going on right now in Massachusetts, it's kind of inevitable that they will arise. One of the big problems is that they often get snuck into general discussion of anti-Semitism, which everybody is perfectly right to be challenging. And we only find out about them after the fact. There are many Zionist organizations in Massachusetts that are pushing the quote unquote new anti-Semitism narrative from the AJC to the JCRC and the ADL. The ADL actually said that CARE, Students for Justice in Palestine, and Jewish Voice for Peace are as bad as right-wing extremists. So in other words, I, as the daughter of Holocaust refugees, am being compared to white supremacist anti-Semites because I stand on the belief that never again means never again for anyone, including Palestinians. I think I'm going to stop now, but I'm sure people want to know what they can do and how this is going to really land in terms of their own actions. And the thing that I would say is that we just need to be alert and to keep as many eyes and ears out. I don't know if you can keep your ears out or your eyes out, but anyway, to spot attempts to silence Palestinian voices. We don't want to be ambushed. The way that we were able to stop anti-BDS legislation in Massachusetts, which was a free speech issue as well as a Palestine solidarity issue, is by having insiders in the State House who let us know what was coming down the pike. The critical thing is to be on the lookout for attempts to pass anti-Semitism resolutions and to see whether or not they target genuine anti-Semitism, which we should support with all of our being, or they're an attempt to invoke support for the state of Israel. If you have a relationship with an elected official, a state rep, a city councilor, please ask them to let you know if there are any anti-Semitism statements that get slipped into legislation or resolutions so that you can either support them or educate people about why they shouldn't be supported. And you can then alert us and we'll help you to mobilize. There's a group of people from Jewish Voice for Peace, Mass Peace Action, the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, and the Unitarian Universalists for Justice in the Middle East, who have been doing legislative work for 5 years to counter attempts to shut down the struggle for Palestinian liberation. And we will support local efforts as we learn about them. So you can email us at jdpboston@gmail.com if you have relationships with elected officials. And I'm going to end it there.